Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we explore the future and what this means for your leadership. We ask the big questions. What's happening on the horizon? What does this mean for us? And most importantly, what skills do I need now for leadership of the future? It's time to explore. Let's go.
Hey, it's Zoe, your friendly neighborhood Canadian-Australian leadership futurist. I love to work with leaders and teams where we look at what's coming and ask ourselves, what does this mean for our teams, our organization, and very importantly, our leadership? Today's guest is an F-16 pilot, which sounds very futuristic, doesn't it? He talks about the third dimension, which is when you go vertical. Sounds very cool. So yes, I am super pumped about this. His name is Dominic Teich, and his nickname is Slice. His fighter pilot nickname, Slice. Yes, it really is a thing. And Dom shares all the inside stories about how he became a fighter pilot, what lessons and insights he learned about himself along the way, and how this applies to leadership focus in the future. Plenty to unpack in this amazing interview, really enjoyable interview. So without further ado, here's Dom. Well, all the way from lovely Phoenix, Arizona, welcome to the show, Dominic Teich.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm excited to be here.
Yep, it's a Friday morning here on the last day in the office for me, and I'm already feeling a bit random, so who knows where this show is going to go today. And I'm super excited to hear your story because I've never had a fighter pilot on the show before. So this is bound to be, well, I'm nerding out on that completely. So I'm pretty thrilled to be here with you to talk about all things fighter pilot leadership and the single seat mindset. So plenty to chat about. First of all, the story. What is your fighter pilot story? What's all that about?
Yeah, so as a kid, I got the itch to fly airplanes. And it just took off from there. You know, I was always interested in the air shows, and I was kind of one of those nerdy little kids that had the remote control airplanes, and I would read books about, you know, airplanes, specifically aerodynamics, and just all the nerdy stuff about aviation. And, you know, there are just a few people in my life that did some very impactful things for me along the way. My dad gave me a fighter jet model when I was 7, and I thought fighter jets were the coolest thing. And then we'd go to air shows, and then my uncle, he worked for Alaskan Airlines rather, and he took me on the flight deck when they were doing engine runs. He was a mechanic, and I just remember standing up there and just thinking, this is the coolest thing. I'm going to be a mechanic one day. And then fast forward, when I started college, I signed up for maintenance school and maintenance, like aircraft mechanic school. And during that time, one of the counselors handed me a flyer and said, well, you should go check out the flight school. And that's what I always wanted to do. And so I actually dropped out of aviation mechanic school and started civilian flight school. And by the time I was 18, I was a civilian flight instructor. So I was getting paid to fly. And then about the time where I had enough hours, I applied to the airlines as well as the U.S. Air Force. And I got picked up by both and figured that the Air Force may not come back around. I can do the airlines later on. And yeah, and then I competed, got in and competed for a fighter spot, and the rest is history.
Is that incredibly competitive to get into being a fighter pilot?
Yes. So if you want to be a fighter, one of the biggest hurdles actually is just your entire life story to get your application accepted, to even get an interview, to either go to an Air Force Academy or to get into ROTC. And then in my case, I went through officer training school. So I actually had completely finished my undergraduate studies. I had all my degrees and everything done. And so then I was applying to the Air Force as just ready to go to pilot training. Typically, what I've seen is that about 10% of a starting class will get selected to go the fighter track. Everybody goes through screening, flight screening, and then from there you go into the actual pilot training, which is, it's like drinking water from a fire hydrant. It's just so much information all at once, and it's all new, and you're flying upside down and you're pulling G's and you're flying in formation. So it's a lot. But out of that initial class, about 10% will get selected to go down a track where they go to a fighter jet trainer. And then out of those, it's anywhere from maybe 75% on the high side to, in my class and in my case, 0% of us got a fighter during our assignment night because the fighter jets were just all backed up. The pipelines were all backed up. So I actually was a fighter jet instructor pilot first, and then I went to fighter jet training after that. So it's incredibly challenging. It's very selective. I'm not saying that because I'm awesome. I'm just saying that it was, for me, in my case, I am willing to outwork anybody to make something happen. And I think that's just part of my character. But by far, I am not one of the top 10% fighter pilots. In fact, I probably sit around about the 50% mark, but I'm just willing to work really hard.
Okay. So, hardworking fighter pilot. How long did you stay in the military flying jets?
I'm still full-time fighter pilot. So
Are you full-time fighter pilot and running a business on top of that?
Yeah.
How the hell do you even do that?
Yeah, back to I'm willing to outwork anybody. My goal is to have these businesses, or my goal was to have the businesses running so that when I retired, I could just run my businesses. And now the businesses are running. So it's pretty cool. So I think we'll meet our goal.
Oh my goodness. So take me through what it feels like to be in a fighter jet and you're whizzing around the skies. What is, like, for somebody who's never been at speed in a vehicle like that, what's the best way to describe it?
So what's really cool so I fly the F-16 right now, and the F-16 fighter jet it's a single seat, single engine, just rocket ship. It's got a bubble canopy, and what that means is that the front it's all shaped, and the canopy curves, and it actually curves down towards the canopy rail. So if you could imagine like where your elbows would sit if your arms were hanging at your sides, the canopy bows inward there. So you can actually be sitting in the seat and just peek over the left or right and see the ground fairly easily. And then additionally, there's no canopy bow. There's no metal structure holding this big piece of plexiglass around you. So it really feels like if you're scared of, if you're, I think, more or less claustrophobic, it may not be a good thing for you, because when you close that canopy lid, you're packed into this little cockpit, and it's an incredible feeling. And the jet, the F-16 actually has computers that tell the control surfaces to move. We call it fly-by-wire. And it's so smooth that I remember the first time I took off, you move the control stick maybe about a 1/16 of an inch, and that jet's going all over the place. I mean, it'll roll. If you move the stick just to the side, it'll roll completely over in a second. You'll just be flipped all the way over. So it's incredibly sensitive controls, and you get used to it after a little while. But it's just an incredible feeling, especially going from 0 miles an hour to, at the departure end of the runway, you're already passing, over 300 miles an hour as you're taking off.
I would imagine that requires an incredible amount of focus. Because if it's so sensitive, you can't just be like, oh, look, there's a bird.
Well, I think, so Zoe, you bring up a good point, and it's something that I didn't really think about for a long time. And I think nobody's born to be a fighter pilot, right? So it's, maybe there are some that have personality traits that lend towards that profession, but more often than not, because I'm an instructor pilot at the schoolhouse, very, very rarely is somebody going to jump into the F-16 and just be good right out the start. And if it's good, sometimes it's just luck. So what I learned from that is that it's a learned behavior. So just like business, just like life, just like college, anything that you do, if you're going to stand in the batter's box as a professional baseball player, you don't get good at that overnight. It's practice, and it's a learned behavior, and you take I have to think about it part of your brain, so the prefrontal cortex, and then you push that information back into your motor cortex, so that when you see certain things, you've learned it, you've seen it before, and your brain has more or less, the plasticity of it has been trained in a way to where it's not all new, right? So even the course that we teach, if you can imagine, the student fighter pilots, they show up and they go through academic training for about the first 6 weeks. And then from there, they jump into this full motion simulator. And the first couple of them are very boring. It's them sitting in there and just flipping switches. Like, here's all the switches, right? And then the first flight that we do with them, we have a couple of 2-seat F-16s where an instructor will sit in the back seat just to make sure they don't kill themselves. And they start the jet up and take off for the first time. And and these are all learned behaviors. So I would be lying if I said anybody could do it, but I would think that, I've had family and friends into the simulators, and I've, somebody that's pretty sharp, I can say, hey, put this thing over here and push the power up here. And within a couple of tries and being able to coach somebody through it, they can land the jet. Now there's a lot more to it than that, but it's a learned behavior.
Okay. Well, that's good to know that people actually learn and practice it and can develop the skills for it. One other thing I want to know about this part of your life is it's called a fighter jet, right? Have you been in any fights? Can you talk about anything like that?
Yeah, so I've been deployed a couple of times. If you can imagine all of the different wars that the world has been fighting for the past however many years, right? Since, you can go back as far as Vietnam, but in my lifetime, the Gulf War really kicked it off. And we've been, the world has been fighting, and now we're in Ukraine. So, I've been deployed a couple of times. I've had the pleasure of being in Australia where you are and, training with the Australians and some other partner nations. And yeah, the second deployment was definitely more ramped up than the first. And it's a dirty business. And, it definitely has given me a different view of the world and mankind. And I would say that it's opposite, I think, of what most people would think. The destruction and the death and all of that stuff has actually made me more patient, more kind, more understanding, and a bigger, better version of who I was before, who had maybe, I would say, a little bit tainted view of what being a fighter pilot is, right? Because it's an incredibly challenging and demanding profession, but then there's also the stakes are pretty high because human life is on the line.
Absolutely. I'm really curious to hear that your perspective has changed to become more patient and more kind. What is it about your fighter pilot experience that has led you to have that changed worldview?
Well, so it took for me that, I don't know if I would call it a failure, but, going through and just being a type A person and wanting to do well and working hard, you tend to, the analogy that I give is that it's a candle tipped on its side and you've got blow torches and you're torching your candle and it's just melting your candle very quickly until it just blows up and it's gone in the middle. And that was me. I did that, at 16 years old, I started flight lessons and I found myself at, 30, 31 years old, having accomplished the majority of my professional career goals as a fighter pilot, as an instructor, as a flight commander, various leadership positions within the Air Force. And then on top of that, there were extended family problems that we don't have to get into, but then, your own family problems and then owning a business, and it all fell apart. And I found out that your brain is very incredible. And, I found myself going through some significant mindset changes through therapy. So I crashed. I had a really big crash a number of years ago. And I just remember about 3 months into it, just getting done with a session and just being so incredibly frustrated that my brain was just scrambled and I didn't know what was going on. And I just remember thinking, I wasn't a failure. The event was the failure. So I had some events in my life that I had failed at. And from that day forward, I just kind of said, well, I'm just going to, pull up my boots tomorrow and we're going to get after it again and just start over. And this can be a big win. And it's kind of maybe a shift in mindset of, I think, for those that have fallen down, if you have a glass half full type of mentality, like I do, it's to a fault. I tend to reframe really bad situations to work in my favor. So, hey, what did I learn from this? In my real estate company, when I was my second apartment complex that I bought, it was a disaster. The complex itself was a disaster. And I messed up the budget for the landscaping and it cost me $110,000 of my own money back when I didn't have any money. I didn't have money. I still don't have money to throw around. Nobody does. But, that was a big failure too. But I just realized that in a 6-month time frame, I bought myself an undergraduate degree and I reframed it and said, I'm going to learn from it. And I've never made the mistake again.
Yeah, well, that is pretty confronting. So you had a lot going on. You had pretty demanding professional career in the military. And then at the same time, you decided to start up a real estate business and misjudged a few things and lost a lot of money. So I can imagine that that's pretty confronting. And so this pit that you fell into and you got yourself out of was, if I'm hearing your story correctly, was the catalyst for you to reframe how you look at other people as well as yourself?
Yeah, I think the biggest change, because I grew up out in the country, shooting guns and lighting fires and building forts and, just being a country boy and working hard. I mean, we were incredibly hard workers. I was one of the lazier kids. It was tough. It was shut up in color and just, work. And so I think the way that I grew up was very maybe emotionally detached from people that complain or that have problems, because the way that I grew up was just put on a smile and get back after it, right? Stop complaining. Well, the problem with that is that there are some people with some legitimate problems, and that ended up being me. And I was the person then in my own mind that my mind was a disaster. And what that taught me was that, there could be somebody that is a peak performer that has done very well throughout their whole life. And then they get hit with a bunch of different life events. And that just helped me humanize other people, going, well, why is it my job to tell you to just put a smile on and be happy? Like, well, let's figure out what's going on and then, make this right. And eventually you can get back on your feet. So I think the understanding part of it was it can happen to anybody. And I mean, I'm not going to get into it because it brings me back to a dark place, but your brain can go to some really weird unlocked containers that you don't want to be in. And you just go, where did that come from? And it's just a lifetime of events that maybe you haven't dealt with. In my case, I call it taking out the trash. So I had this life trash can and I would just throw stuff in it and I would slam the lid back on. Well, it got full. So I upgraded to a dumpster and I kept slamming the lid and filling it up. And then I bought a 40-yard dumpster, and you kind of get the point is that one day I just decided to climb up the side of it and just sleep in a dumpster. And I was in all of the trash of my life. I didn't know how to get out. So for me, in my case, because it's different for everybody, is, well, somebody threw a ladder down into the dumpster and I just slowly climbed out of it and figured out, well, how did I get there in the first place? But that gave me a different perspective to just view that other people, I mean, everybody, your brain is so crazy. It can just literally flip you on your head in an instant for something that maybe is just subconscious.
Yeah, I think a lot of people listening, and myself included, understand where you're coming from. There's plenty of things that we put in our metaphoric trash can of life and prefer not to look at, experience again. And there it sits bubbling away, fermenting, growing.
Yes.
And I'm curious about your definition of success before and after this major catalyst event. How did you define success prior to that? And has it changed since then?
Massively, Zoe. And thank you for asking that, because that is one of the things that I had defined success very, I guess now I can say this, I'm not ashamed to, but selfishly. So success to me was, being a fighter pilot, being an instructor, buying a certain amount of apartments, having a certain amount of money, right? And then that was how I defined success. And the problem with that within the context of a life story, at least in my case, was what I learned was that you can earn, maybe you buy this huge apartment complex in my case, and then you sell it for $20 million, and then you have all this money, and then your story stops because there's no depth to that story. The why wasn't there. And so I think what changed in the way that I define success is anytime that the success is me oriented and it points back to me, I then have to ask, well, why? And if I do achieve this goal or this big project or whatever it is that makes me successful, does that point at me or is there significance beyond me? So that's really what changed was, hey, does it continue my story on? So like if I sell this apartment complex and then I give $1 million to charity and then use the other money to do X, Y, and Z, and it's, it changes the way that you look at your projects. And that's what kind of led us to writing these books, the Single Seat Wisdom series. They're compilations of fighter pilot stories. is, one guy told me, he's like, well, you can make all this money and then, you die and your kids just fight over it and then they squander it. Within one generation, everything you worked your whole life for. And so I was like, well, that was some pretty good insight. And so I'm like, well, if I start writing books and capture these stories, they're timeless in essence, and my kids are not going to be able to travel around the world and pull these books off of people's shelves. So not only for that business specifically, we give all the money to a children's cancer nonprofit. We publish fighter pilot stories. They're short stories, and there's 20 of them in every book. The fighter pilots get a share, and then the fighter pilots, just to be a part of the books, they give to the charity. So it's a big circle of everybody helping everybody. And then the people that buy the books know that the money goes to charity and that they get something out of it that makes them better. So it's kind of, that really helped the timeless significance piece of success, right? And then it doesn't have to be, we did this and now it's all over. It's, well, we wrote the first book and then people really liked it, so we wrote another one, and now we're writing the third one, and it just kind of it has grown into its own little, ecosystem.
That's really lovely. I love that genesis of what success means and how you can change your lens and still be creating and being entrepreneurial, and yet the flavor of it and the impact of it shifts quite exponentially. So that's really cool. Hey, it's Zoe. If you're enjoying these leadership insights, join us in the Amplifiers Academy. It's bite-sized leadership development through self-paced videos and exercises, templates, checklists, resources, and an online community to connect with other leaders. It's Amplifiers Academy, your gateway to better, stronger leadership. See you there. I want to know about your nickname. So, Maverick came out this year, the follow-up from Tom Cruise's original movie, and the fighter pilots all have names in there. Is that really a thing? Does that really happen?
Absolutely. So I think everybody's at least curious, and this doesn't just exist per se within the fighter pilot community. I mean, even police officers do this. They give each other nicknames, and what I've found is that generally it's from something that you did that was either you did something stupid, or you tried to kill yourself. In my case, not literally, but like it was a near-death experience. But in these close-knit teams, I mean, I would assume that professional baseball players have nicknames for each other too. But in my case, I had a very close pass with. If you're familiar, like if you've watched the Top Gun movies where they dogfight, right, where they're very close to each other. One jet is trying to shoot the other jet before they get killed, and you're practicing these tactics. These, one jet is simulating an enemy, and you're the good guy trying to kill them first. Well, I was doing that as a young fighter pilot, and I broke a training rule, so I was pointing at the other jet too long, and I had a very close pass with my instructor pilot at the time, and I was in Japan, an American fighter squadron stationed there in Japan, and we were the samurai. So they said I tried to slice my instructor pilot in half, and it kind of fit with the story of me almost dying. And it was a reminder that you could view it as a failure, but in my case, your call sign eventually grows on you, and I've definitely had worse call signs in my career, but slice has stuck.
Okay, I love it. Yeah, I can imagine that. Because if you're saying like the controls are so sensitive, and if you just nick it a little bit, that could be a huge disaster.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to your single seat wisdom book and the single seat mindset, which is the thrust of one of your businesses. So let me just check in around your actual businesses. So you're still doing the fighter pilot thing, and you've got a real estate business and now a publication business. Is there anything else that's part of your entrepreneurial setup?
Yeah, so I actually, getting back to the significance, I basically turned off a business that was profitable, but it was not fulfilling our why. It was all about money. I grew up in a family where my uncles and family would go to auctions and they buy and sell stuff, maybe fix it up or whatever. And you can get into the big stuff like buying and selling tractors and stuff like that. But it was so transactional. It was wearing us out, and it was all about money. So I decided to turn that business off, and it was a great decision. My real estate business is more or less set up with contractors that I hire to do the work, and I just oversee it. And now Single Seat Mindset is the parent business. And we're basically the largest online group of fighter pilots in online and print. And we're here to help people or guide more or less action takers, peak performers, type A personalities with fighter pilot lessons and what we've learned, in the third dimension, and people in all different career fields, peak performance career fields, whether that's doctors, accountants, pilots, of course, but even athletes, coaches. A lot of these are very leverageable concepts that we've been able to share.
So first of all, what is lessons in the third dimension? What is the third dimension?
Yeah, so as soon as you take off, you're now exploring the third dimension, which is vertical. So as people on the ground, we either walk forward, backwards, side to side, but then when you take off in a fighter jet, you get to jump into that third dimension, which allows you, I said this to my kids the other day and it makes me laugh because they kind of looked at me weird until I explained it, but I said, if you adopt an attitude of gratitude, then you can obtain some high altitude. And they just stopped and they're like, Dad, what's altitude? And then I had to explain that to them. But yeah, the third dimension, we get to play around and, from when I take off here, we practice these flame out landings, because if you lose power, if you lose thrust in your one engine airplane and your single engine airplane, you have to practice gliding. Essentially, we have the glide ratio of the space shuttle. So we practice these flame out landings, and we go from 1,000 feet off the ground up to 10,000 feet in a number of seconds. And so it's just an incredible feeling, even still having done it for a number of years, and just seeing the world kind of fall back behind you as you're cruising up to 10,000 feet in a very short time.
That's really cool. All right, so single seat mindset. What is single seat mindset? You explained that like the fighter jet, there's just enough room for you.
Yes.
Is that presumably the analogy? But what does it mean from a mindset point of view?
Yeah. So the thing that I think most people take away from, why would I listen to a single seat fighter pilot and what do they have to share? And it's not a selfish message, right? So even though you are sitting in the jet by yourself, very rarely do we fly as just one aircraft. So we're normally employing in 2 to 4 to 8. We employ and we work as a team. So what started single seat mindset is I was actually mountain biking one day and I was frustrated with some rigid structures and slow processes within my real estate business. And I wasn't getting any deliverable outcomes, right? And so what I learned was, I'm like, well, fighter pilots, like the ones at Single Seat Mindset and myself and just those around the world, we make decisions very, very fast, right? And again, it's going back to what we said earlier in this interview, is that it's a learned behavior. And so making those decisions at 800 plus miles an hour, I didn't start out that way, Zoe. I started out at 80 miles an hour in a small airplane, right? And then I built up to it. And those decision-making skills were very leverageable to high-performance professions. So with the single seat mindset, I decided that it would be less optimal if it was just myself talking about these lessons. And so that's why I brought in, for our first book and for the launch, essentially, it was 20 fighter pilots. And now we have 40, and now we're growing even more than that. So they're life lessons from varying perspectives, all from fighter pilots, and they're applied to just a ton of different life lessons, whether or not that's, one of the chapters is, or one of the fighter pilots wrote about fighter pilot fatherhood. Another fighter pilot in, volume 2, he is a business owner. He owns apartments as well. And, he wrote about missionizing your business. Another one that I know that was actually a student of mine a number of years ago, he wrote about the art of a fighter pilot debrief. So the life lessons are essentially a spin on, what we've learned as fighter pilots and how we apply those to our daily life. And they're very leverageable and applicable. And you don't have to be an aviator. You don't even have to be a pilot. And that's I review all the stories to make sure that somebody reading it does not need to have any sort of special education, background degrees, none of that. They don't even have to be a pilot, but they would understand the story and be able to apply it in whatever field they're in.
Cool. Dom, I want to know about the fighter pilot debrief. What's that like?
Yeah, so it is, I think that for me is the biggest and most important and most often overlooked part of owning a business. So that hands down has been the debrief and how you debrief and the construct. And actually, Dirty is his call sign. His last name is Bird. So Dirty Bird wrote his chapter in this book, and not only did he go through the Air Force Top Gun school, he is a Top Gun instructor. So he was an instructor for the best instructors in the world. And in there, if you're like, well, how do I do it? He has a little chart that you start at the top, and it's just these questions that get you to the root cause. And the main point is, so for me in my business, there was one day where I came home and I was just angry. I was just mad about whatever. And it wasn't until I debriefed that day where I was actually able to stop and slow down and go, well, why am I angry? What happened today? And I found out that I am terrible at being a property manager. And so that's when I started hiring professional property managers. And then I also realized that even though I went to school and had accounting backgrounds and I could do accounting, I hated doing it. So then I hired a professional accountant. And so I think the debrief, that's an oversimplification of it, but debriefing yourself and going, hey, this happened. Here was maybe the result. Maybe we're trying to get here. Is that a complete failure? Did we win or did we learn? What do we take away from that? The most tricky one, Zoe, is when you win really hard. So let's say you put this project into motion and it's just a fantastic success, but you never debrief. And what you don't realize is that it was luck. Maybe it was the market. Maybe it was just total beginner's luck. And then you go do the same thing over and it's a complete failure. It's because you didn't debrief and recognize that, yes, maybe we made a ton of money, but through inflation or through this neighborhood that you had no plan or even know-how, it just was total luck. That's the one that will catch you the most. So I think, Dirty talks about little mini debriefs through the day. You can do it however you want. You can call it something different too, but it's just pausing and going, hey, I just did this thing. I just planned, I executed this, and now I'm debriefing and I go, well, did I follow my plan? What happened when I executed? Did I get the result that I wanted, or was the plan put into action? And you just kind of do these mini debriefs, and I do them every day. And every morning I start with, this is a different tangent, but my 5 minutes in the morning, but it's like a debrief review of the previous day. And then you get yourself off on the right foot as you start out.
That's very intentional, Dom. So is this something that you started as part of your career as a fighter pilot, or something you've developed along the way?
Along the way, and it was through the School of Hard Knocks. So I call it the achievement hamster wheel, and that's what I was stuck in. I was a peak performer, I was a high achiever, and I was a very, very, my dad was a workaholic, and that's what I became, was a workaholic. Both of us are not anymore, but you get stuck in this motion of just doing stuff all the time. And people, you want to feel busy and you want to feel needed and all of this stuff. And people are like, well, what do you got? You got a lot of stuff going on. And you're like, yeah, I'm just doing stuff all the time, just lists and stuff. And that's not the way to live your life. It's, yes, you can get a lot of stuff done, but what I found is that maybe about 1% of the things that I was doing was actually advancing my overall goal. And the only reason I knew what my overall goal was through some failures and picking myself back up and learning from that and being willing and humble enough to learn from that. And then having my big mental crash and going, well, I don't really know what my significance is when I start my day. So let's just start the day I started with 15 minutes. I couldn't sit still that long. So I started with 5 minutes. And I just go, hey, what's my intention of today? If I look back and go, what one thing did I do today that was of significance that I can say today was a success? What would that be? And I never stopped, Zoe. I was just doing and going and doing stuff. And I didn't have a very well-crafted plan. So I just do a lot less now, but I am much more intentional with what I'm doing.
So thank you for sharing that, Dom, because you've got a lot of activity still. You're a full-time fighter pilot and you're running your real estate business or managing it. And you've got this publication business with the single seat mindset. each one of those things is fairly fulsome, and yet you don't consider yourself a workaholic because of the different flavor you have on it, that it's intentional. What's your overall goal now, and how is it different?
So where it has changed is, I think there's long term where my goal is to basically stop doing so much stuff and pour my energy into something that is much more meaningful. And so I've actually taken my foot off of the accelerator in the real estate business. We actually just sold a property, and I don't have plans to buy one right now. So we're kind of offloading, stuff from there because the plan worked. And now I'm focusing a little bit more attention on the single seat mindset business and the online presence and doing podcasts like this and kind of sharing what we've learned and giving back. And it just gives us a lot more, and putting that attention into my family and setting up an environment that is conducive to, family life and kids that come back and, bring their grandkids around and are sharing and helpful. And we live this much more deep life versus just always working. Because that's what I felt. And I think that's not a bad thing. There are times in your life where you need to be working really diligently to achieve stuff. But then there's got to be a point where you're like, okay, the machine is kind of churning. What do I need to start doing right now? And then more importantly, what can I stop doing? So just shovel those things off to the side. Who can I put into these positions that keep the machine running? And that's really what has helped. So now that we're doing this third book, we've actually published 5 total books, but the third single seat wisdom book, the team is set up. The process is set up. The website is set up. Like everything is set up. The framework is set up. And so it's not like I'm just starting something from scratch.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I want to finish our conversation with talking about leadership of the future. So leaders face a lot of challenges right now. You've been a leader for a long time in different forums, in different forays. What do you think is changing for leaders, and how does it affect how leaders need to show up, do you think?
So I haven't actually talked about this on a podcast, so I'm kind of excited, but I alluded to it earlier. We just sold a property, and the person that bought it, it was their first multifamily acquisition. So it was their first apartment building that they bought. And I thought it went really well. I thought the transaction went well. We closed, we all, shook hands. And then the next thing I know is that we're getting threats that we're being sued for certain things. So I think for the first couple of hours when I heard that, because I'm the business owner, this is my property. Now, granted, I do have some investors, but as I sold this, I'm like, well, I'm the one that is in charge of the transaction and running this. And, I'm the principal partner, and everybody's freaking out for the first several hours. And it kind of disturbed me because I thought, what the heck? We had a great time. And from a leadership standpoint, what I learned was I went back to a fighter pilot, an old crusty fighter pilot, that he said when the guys on the ground are talking on the radio to a fighter pilot in the air, if they're getting shot or if they're getting shelled, the way that they talk to you is going to be very intense, right? Like your heart rate's going to start going. And that's what was happening, is that I was getting information from the brokers and the partners that worked on the transaction to get it sold, but I was just hearing their side, and they were all amped up. Everybody was freaking out. It was the sky is falling situation. And I went back to talking to that joint terminal air controller, the guy on the ground, and I was like, everybody's losing their minds. There needs to be a voice of reason, right? And it's the fighter pilot's job to calm down the situation on the ground the best they can. And the way that you do that is that you talk methodically and you slow everybody down. So what I just said was, this sounds bad. Like nobody likes to get sued, but anybody can sue anybody nowadays. So give me the facts, send me the documents. I want to review them, and I'll get back to you tomorrow. And so I looked at the documents, and 90% of the stuff that they were complaining about was not even a factor. The other one, as we dug into that, really is not a factor. And I looped in a couple other business owners and talked to them. And I said, hey, everybody's losing their mind. And the lesson was, if you're the person that's in the leadership position, people are going to look to you, and your whole physiology will determine how people react. And that's the problem, is that people were reacting and there was no plan. Everybody was just freaking out about everything. And so I just slowed everybody down. I said, this is not a big deal. It's a big deal to you, which means it is a deal. Like, I want to make this right. And we calm everybody down. So that's been my job for this last week, is just calm everybody down, because behind a new buyer, he may have investors behind him. He may have an attorney that's amping him up. He may have a wife that's screaming at him. And I can't affect any of those people. But what I can do is that anybody that is in my circle of influence, they need somebody that's calm, cool, and collected. And then, as fighter pilots say, you need to be clear, concise, and correct. So at the end of the conversation, very clearly and concisely, what did we get out of this conversation? Summarize it if you're the leader. And then what is the correct action to be taken? And then everybody high fives and boom, we're off to the races. And we just had a couple of those conversations today, and we'll see where it goes. But just stay calm, just chill.
I think that's really useful advice and probably timeless, regardless of circumstances. And I love the picture of fighter pilots being clear, concise, and correct and calm while everybody else is losing their minds.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Dom, this has been really amazing. I've really enjoyed your perspective and your stories and your insight of your career. And there's still so much to come. You look about 20 to me. So there's
thanks.
Plenty of leadership wisdom to come in your experience. Last call in terms of anything that you'd like to say in terms of your best advice for leaders who are listening. That's the first question. And the second one is, where can people find out more about you and your work? So advice for listeners, and where can we get more?
Yeah, I would just say that the one thing for the listeners of your podcast, when we kind of touched on it, was don't be afraid of getting so busy that you kind of get burnt out a little bit. That's part of learning. Because then during that time, you're going to find out what you are good at and specifically what you're not good at, and be humble enough to admit you're not good at it or you don't like doing it, and shove that, if you're the business owner, shove that off to somebody else. So that would be my biggest takeaway for myself. I'm speaking to myself, 10 years ago, is I wanted to do everything myself because I knew that I could do it better. I was convinced of that. And that's actually false. There are people that could do things a lot better than me, it turns out. And then just realize that that's part of the learning process, and burn yourself out, and then just pick yourself back up again, learn from it, start over and go, okay, here's what I learned from that. And just realize, I think it was Tony Robbins that said, failure is an event, not a person. So when the event fails, just realize you need to debrief yourself and take those lessons from that and then reapply it to your next strategy. People can find me at singleseatmindset.com. That's our main website. It's got different offshoots to everywhere else. I think that's the one place that we have most of our stuff. There's a bunch of different websites, but you can get it all there.
That's great. Dom, thank you so much. This has been just a pleasure and absolute privilege to find out more about fighter pilot life and fighter pilot insights and lessons. Have a great rest of your day over there in Phoenix.
Thank you, Zoe.
That was so much fun. I just loved hearing about the F-16 pilot stuff. All that kind of high peak performance environment I find absolutely fascinating, and Dom completely delivered on that. I loved how we talked about the achievement hamster wheel. I'm like, yes, I've been there before. I know it's definitely a stage of leadership maturity that many of us have gone through or are going through, where we're just climbing lots and lots of different mountains and then stop to wonder, really? This is exhausting, and what is the purpose and point of it all? And that pausing and reframing what it is that we're doing is so essential in our leadership journey. And I'm so grateful that Dom shared that. I love also that he shared that one of the key insights you need as a leader is to remain calm. When everybody else is dropping their bundle, I think is the expression in Australia, dropping their bundle and losing their stuff, that as a leader, we need to manage our own biochemistry, our own biology, slow things down, remain cool and collected, and people can recalibrate to our own core vibration. That is a skill that is never going to go out of style, regardless of the future and regardless of context. So we need to master that and keep keep on with it as we go forward into the future. If you like this podcast, please share with others. Please also give us a 5-star review. The social proof stuff really does work, and we want to get these messages out to more and more people so that we have listeners who are leaders who are becoming better leaders and better listeners. And the other thing is Amplifiers Academy. So if you're looking at ways to improve your own leadership performance, we have made my mainstay and flagship course, Amplifiers, available as an online self-study program. You can find more at zoerouth.com, click on programs, and you will find Amplifiers Academy there. Do consider joining us and investing in your leadership with a group of like-minded, amazing people. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast. To find out more about leadership of the future or to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.